What if Silvers Rayleigh raised Luffy? Imagine the last living member of the Roger Pirates, the man who spent 20 years hiding from the entire world, deciding one small boy in the East Blue is worth coming out of hiding for. How would the history of the One Piece world change? Imagine this. Rayleigh's never planned to stay in Fusha Village longer than a season. He's carrying something he was never supposed to still have. A fruit Roger pressed into his hands the day the crew went their separate ways. The last order the Pirate King ever gave him before turning himself in. Get rid of it somewhere the government will never think to look. Fusha's about as far from anywhere as the world gets, which is exactly why he picks it. He doesn't plan on a 7-year-old finding his bag while he's asleep on the beach. He doesn't plan on that same 7-year-old swallowing the fruit whole before he can even open his eyes. By the time Rayleigh's on his feet, it's already done, and Roger's last order has just become considerably harder to carry out. He could leave. 20 years of hiding have taught him exactly how to disappear from a place before anyone notices he was there. Instead, he sits back down on the sand next to the kid coughing up seawater beside him and doesn't leave for a very long time. Word gets out slower than it would have for anyone else, mostly because nobody in the East Blue has any reason to suspect the quiet old man running odd jobs around Fusha is the Dark King himself. That doesn't last. A Marine report on an unusually powerful child in Goa Kingdom crosses the wrong desk in Marine headquarters, and it isn't long before the name attached to the investigation makes several people very uncomfortable at once. Sengoku reads the file twice before setting it down without a word. The 5 elders read it once and immediately bury it, because the report doesn't just mention a strange child. It mentions Silvers Rayleigh, alive, in hiding, and apparently no longer alone. Garp finds out the old-fashioned way, showing up in Fusha for one of his usual unannounced visits and nearly putting his own grandson through a wall on instinct when Rayleigh steps out of the house to greet him first. You? Me. Garp's hand doesn't leave the hilt of his weapon for a long, tense minute. You've been hiding in my grandson's village. Didn't know it was your grandson's village when I picked it. Neither of them relaxes. Not fully. Not for weeks. But Garp doesn't turn him in either. And the longer he watches Rayleigh with Luffy, patient in a way nothing about the Dark King's reputation ever suggested, the less he's sure turning him in is even the right call anymore. You're really going to teach him. Someone's going to. Might as well be the version of me that already knows what mistakes not to repeat. Garp doesn't answer that. He just keeps visiting, and keeps not mentioning it to anyone at headquarters. The years that follow look nothing like the childhood Luffy was supposed to have. Rayleigh doesn't train him the way Garp would have. No brutal drills, no fist of love knocking him through trees. He teaches the way Roger's crew used to teach each other, slow, deliberate, built on stories instead of orders. Observation Haki first, because a boy who can't see a punch coming is a boy who's already lost. Armament next, because rubber alone was never going to be enough against the world Rayleigh's actually seen. There are years where progress barely shows at all. Luffy face down in the sand more mornings than not, and Rayleigh never once raises his voice about it. Roger used to say strength that comes too easy doesn't stick. Yours is going to stick. And somewhere in the space between all of it, without either of them planning it, Conqueror's Haki surfaces the same way it always does. Unasked for, undeniable. The first time Luffy refuses to back down from something twice his size. Rayleigh doesn't look surprised. He looks like a man watching a very old story start repeating itself. Your dad had it too. Roger, I mean. Not the other one. Luffy asks what he means by that maybe 100 times over the years. Rayleigh never quite answers it the same way twice. He does answer other things, though patiently, honestly, in a way nobody else in Luffy's life ever has. Stories about the Void Century, about a truth the world government spent 800 years trying to bury, about a name Roger said once at the very end of the world and never got to explain. Luffy doesn't understand most of it at 7, or 10, or even 14. By 17, it's the kind of thing that's quietly reshaped how he sees every flag he's ever been told to fear. At 17, Luffy sets sail, and Rayleigh doesn't follow him onto the ship, no matter how much Luffy argues that he should. This part's not mine to give you. You have to go find it yourself. The East Blue plays out close enough to how it always has. Zoro's freed from Shell's Town the same as ever, though he takes one look at Luffy's Haki-coated punch flattening a Marine captain and reconsiders his read on the rookie captain by about 3 levels. Nami joins for her own reasons. Usopp tags along out of Syrup Village. Sanji signs on off the Barati. None of them fully understand yet how far ahead of a normal East Blue rookie their captain actually is. only that fights that should take minutes keep ending in seconds. Alabasta makes that gap impossible to ignore. Crocodile expects a stubborn kid with a rubber body and nothing else. He gets a stubborn kid whose observation Haki reads every sand clone before it finishes forming, whose armament-coated fists hit Crocodile's real body clean through Logia intangibility on the very first real exchange. "That's not supposed to be possible yet," Crocodile says, genuinely rattled for the first time in the fight, sand whipping harder around him like it might make up the difference. It doesn't. Every clone he throws up gets read and bypassed before it finishes forming, and by the time he realizes the fight was never actually close, he's already buried under his own city. "Nobody told you," Luffy says, standing over the wreckage, barely out of breath. Robin, watching from the ruins of Rainbase, joins without needing to be convinced twice, and admits before the week's out that she's never seen someone his age move like he's already survived a dozen wars nobody's told her about yet. Skypiea sharpens the same edge further. Enel's mantra is built to read minds that haven't been trained to hide anything from it, and for the first time in the story, it runs into someone whose observation Haki was built by a man who spent 2 decades staying alive purely by never being where people expected him to be. Enel loses that fight badly, and loses it fast. Water 7 follows, new ships built, Frankie recruited into the crew's orbit, and then Robin's taken, and Eni's lobby turns into the fight that finally shows the world exactly what kind of monster Rayleigh's been quietly building. CP9 throws everything they have at him. Rob Lucci, freshly awakened, matches him blow for blow right up until the moment it isn't a fight anymore. A buster call opens the sky. Kizaru arrives, and somewhere in the middle of it, taking hits that should have ended him twice over, refusing to stay down because Robin's still up ahead and he hasn't reached her yet, Luffy's heart simply stops. For a few seconds, nobody on that battlefield moves. Then, dum. A single beat rises out of the silence. Dum, dum. White smoke curls off his skin. His hair bleaches white. The stone beneath him bends like it's forgotten what stone is supposed to do. Somewhere far away, on a beach in Fusha Village he hasn't seen in years, Rayleigh feels something shift in the world and sets down the drink in his hand without quite knowing why. Luffy stands. He's laughing, lighter than he's ever felt, and Lucci realizes half a second too late that nothing he does is landing anymore. One overwhelming strike sends him through 3 walls. Luffy grabs the key, frees Robin, and carries her out through a tower that's coming apart around them exactly like the government always feared something like this would. Thriller bark passes in its usual chaos not long after. Oars falls, Brook joins the crew, and somewhere in the fog a shadow none of them fully understand yet watches the whole fight a little too closely and decides not to move. Not tonight. Sabaody is where it all finally catches up to them. The island's supposed to be a quiet resupply before the new world, and for a while, it almost is. Then the report from Eni's lobby reaches the highest levels of the government, the one confirming exactly whose student was standing in that tower when the world went white. And this time, they don't send vice admirals to contain it. They send Saint Shamrock and the Holy Knights instead, and behind them, walking through a wall of celestial dragon guards like they're furniture, Figureland Garling. Luffy throws everything he's learned at him, and for the first time in this entire story, it isn't enough on its own. Garling reads every movement before it lands, cutting him out of the air with brutal, practiced precision honed over a career longer than Luffy's been alive. Sea prism chains stretch between the mangrove trees, narrowing every path Luffy tries to bounce through. Government warships open fire on the half-finished coating yard. Pacifistas flood every entrance. Luffy's dragged down onto one knee, Haki flickering thin around blows he'd normally shrug off without thinking. Then, cutting through the smoke from the harbor, an old, familiar voice arrives exactly when it's needed most. "Took you long enough to get in over your head, kid." Rayleigh steps onto the battlefield for the first time since Fusha, blade already drawn, 20 years of hiding finally spent on the one thing he decided was worth breaking cover for. Garling turns from Luffy to face him instead, and for the first time all fight, something in the Holy Knight's expression shifts toward actual caution. The Dark King. Retired. You're making me reconsider that. Between the two of them, the tide of the fight finally turns. Rayleigh clears a path through the Holy Knights with the kind of economy that only comes from having done this exact thing 100 times before Luffy was even born. Blade work honed on the deck of the Oro Jackson against enemies the rest of the world's already forgotten. Luffy, given room to breathe for the first time in the fight, drives Garling backwards step by step. Haki-coated fists finally landing clean, one after another, driving him back through the tree line. "You trained him," Garling says, catching his breath for the first time. "Every mistake I made, so he wouldn't have to," Rayleigh answers. Garling doesn't get the chance to respond to that. A Den Mushi crackles to life behind the Holy Knights, and whatever order comes through it pulls Garling back from the fight entirely, retreating through the mangroves before either Luffy or Rayleigh can press the advantage. It isn't a victory so much as an interruption, and the reason for it reaches them within the hour. Port Gas D, Ace has been captured. A war is being called at Marineford, and the entire Navy is already mobilizing around it. Rayleigh doesn't hesitate. "Then, we're going." Luffy doesn't argue. Marineford is already burning by the time they arrive, Whitebeard's fleet colliding head-on with the full might of the Navy. Rayleigh cuts a path through the outer lines the moment their ship makes port, clearing enough space for Luffy to push straight into the heart of the battlefield without losing momentum to the first wave of vice admirals sent to stop him. It's the three admirals waiting past that first wave that almost end the whole thing right there, Akainu, Kizaru, and Aokiji converging on him at once. The full weight of the Marine's strongest deciding a rookie with a straw hat and a dead man's fruit isn't a threat worth sharing between them. Magma, light, and ice come at him from three directions in the same breath, and for a handful of seconds it's all Luffy can do to keep from being erased outright. Then Whitebeard's Bicento crashes into the space between them, forcing Akainu back a full step, and a wall of blue phoenix flames sweeps in low from the other side, Marco driving Kizaru's kick wide before it connects. "Go easy on him, Pops," Marco says. He's not our biggest problem today. Split apart instead of stacked on one target, the fight finally becomes survivable. Luffy doesn't win it alone. He was never going to. But with Whitebeard holding Akainu and Marco keeping Kizaru and Aokiji busy, Luffy claws his way to the execution platform anyway. The chains come off. Ace is free. The Navy doesn't let it end there. Word reaches Sengoku that the boy tearing through three admirals is the same one responsible for Eni's lobby, and that report goes further than Marine headquarters this time. It goes to Mary GOI's. St. Saturn doesn't arrive like a reinforcement. He arrives like a verdict. The battlefield going quiet in a way gunfire and Haki never managed to make it. Every soldier on both sides feeling the weight of something none of them were prepared to stand in front of. His orders are simple, and everyone close enough to hear them understands exactly what they mean. Eliminate the boy. Whitebeard's the one who steps into his path. "Not today, you don't." Marco's beside him before the sentence finishes, Phoenix flames already catching along both arms. "Pops, get everyone else out. That's an order, not a request." Marco doesn't argue with him, not because he agrees, but because he's spent enough years under this man to know exactly which orders aren't up for debate. Rayleigh pulls Luffy back by the collar before he can throw himself at Saturn too. "Not this fight. Not yet. I can't just leave them." "You're not leaving them. You're letting them finish something they already decided on." Ace, barely standing, doesn't argue either, not with Whitebeard's hand already pushing him toward the retreating ships. The Moby Dick and everything still able to sail pulls back through a corridor Whitebeard and Marco carve open and hold, buying every second the retreat needs against a man neither of them are entirely sure they can beat. By the time the last ship clears the harbor, Marineford is still burning, and the two men who bought that escape are still standing in the middle of it, refusing to be the reason anyone else doesn't make it out. Luffy watches the coastline shrink from the deck of a borrowed ship, Ace alive beside him, breathing, safe, and says nothing for a long time. Rayleigh doesn't try to fill the silence either. Some debts don't get explained. They just get carried. This is what would have happened if Rayleigh raised Luffy. But what do you think would have happened if Ace inherited the Gura Gura no Mi instead of Blackbeard?